Hello, Sheriff Mina. Thank you so much for joining me on Culture Chat.
Good to be here, Mimi. Thank you.
Well, it's lovely to see you. You, of course, are a previous guest on the show, so I'm really happy that you were persuaded to come back.
Yeah, I love your show. I know, you ask the tough questions, and I'm not afraid to answer them.
Well, excellent. We're going to jump right in because I know your time is limited. Um, There's a lot going on in the world right now amidst the pandemic, amidst probably one of the highest racial tensions we've had in recent times. And I think, regardless of who would be sitting in your role right now of leadership of law enforcement, it would be a really tough position to be in. However, I also believe that's a really good thing because I believe with discomfort and adversity comes change. And as somebody who's really passionate about the Black Lives Matter movement, I feel there's been a lot of talk about change and some incremental change recently, but maybe not even enough of it. And I know, though, that that's much easier said than done, and that things don't go as quick as one day. There's an issue and it gets fixed right away. But I know that the community around the world, or around the nation especially, has been asking for police reform and defunding the department. What's your response to that?
Yeah. So first, let me go back to why this all started, or why it got reinvigorated. The George Floyd killing was wrong. I was one of the first law enforcement leaders in this area to come out and denounce the actions of those officers in that incident. And I think law enforcement does need to change, but I think we deserve a little credit for the incremental changes that we have made over past several decades. You're seeing more law enforcement officers charged with crime, more law enforcement officers terminated for excessive force cases. Of course, 5 years ago, none of the agencies in Central Florida, or 5 or 6 years ago, none of the agencies in Central Florida had body-worn cameras. Now they all do, and I think now more than ever, we're really doing a lot better job nationally of listening to our community. I think in Orlando and Orange County, we have a strong and solid record of listening to our community and bringing change when needed. And in light of recent events, and there have been many discussions from our community, and I've been involved in a lot of those. And people have been asking for change. I guess the good news is that many of the things that people have been asking for, a duty to intervene, a ban on chokeholds, those are the policies, training that already exist within the agencies here in Central Florida. So we have done a good job in that respect, and we're open to the discussion, and I think making sure the community is involved is key. I know there have been lots of ideas and discussion about defunding, law enforcement, and here's where I stand on that. All of those social issues that we talk about, mental health, homelessness, drug and alcohol treatment, those are all very important things that need to be funded, but not at the expense of our safety and law enforcement. Because to properly fund those entities, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, and my budget is only so big, and most of our budget is personnel. So if we start cutting from the sheriff's office budget, you're talking about laying off deputies. And every day I talk to county commissioners, I talk to residents, and they want more law enforcement in their neighborhoods to help reduce violent crime. And then lastly, I think we have come a long way, especially here locally, and really, not so much focusing on those low-level offenses that are caused by homelessness, such as panhandling and minor drug offenses. We are focusing and targeted on the people who are committing the most violent and heinous crimes in our community.
Yeah, and I understand everything that you've explained there. That makes a lot of sense, of course. But I think the bigger argument or question by a lot of citizens and people are one that, of course, law enforcement officers, most of them, what they sign up for is to, enforce the law, and it's usually not to take some of the calls that I think that is what people are saying, that funds could be going towards other workers that are more either trained, whether it's a mental health professional. And of course there's that line, right? Well, if you go to a call, it could become violent, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the statistics and a lot of research shows that there are a lot of mental health professionals that are a little bit more capable or trained in effect to help some of those scenarios. So I know that you said that, of course, we don't want to lay officers off because we do need law enforcement, but I feel like there is maybe more training to be done, or do you feel like there is still a gap missing there, or do you feel like what you have is still sufficient to take on all the calls that you are getting?
Well, a few things on that. Great question. So one of the things that we have been doing, we're getting all of our deputies trained in crisis intervention, and that's a 40-hour course taught by mental health specialists that give our deputies the tools to deal with people who are in mental crisis and help de-escalate those situations. The second thing I'm doing is I am actually looking at a model, and I started this long before people were calling for it. So back in January, I sent commanders to California and to Miami to look at some of those models that pair deputies and mental health specialists together. So I am looking at doing a pilot program with that. And then lastly, I will say that sometimes social workers or mental health specialists aren't always best equipped to respond to those calls. And I'll give you a quick example. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a man who was in mental crisis, running around half naked at the intersection of Sand Lake Road and International Drive. He was throwing himself in front of cars, blocking traffic. And so our deputies who were already out on the street were able to respond using the lights and sirens, and get there quickly, de-escalate the situation, get the man the help that he needed, and totally diffuse that in a quick amount of time. So when we're talking about social workers or mental health specialists, responding on their own, are they going to respond from home? Are they going to be available at 3 o'clock in the morning? Are they going to be available on holidays and Thanksgiving and Christmas? And then to bring my point home even more, 4 or 5 months ago, we responded to the exact same call. Okay, a half-naked man on drugs, obviously in some type of mental crisis, and in an intersection, he was actually throwing himself in front of cars, uh, and then went into a furniture store. When the deputies got there, he pulled out a knife. And so, all these ideas and suggestions about people responding, non-law enforcement responding to these types of calls, these things have to be taken into consideration. And I know that if you looked in just recently, today or yesterday in St. Petersburg, they're looking at doing a model like that. And I know the paramedics and firefighters are not too happy with that because they go to a lot of those calls as well. And many times they call for law enforcement as backup because they are the ones that deal with that, and a lot of those calls can turn violent. So I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done before we just jump in and start changing the way we have done things for hundreds of years.
Yeah, yeah, and this is probably something we'll have to table for a future conversation because there's so much to
There,
what that means, defunding the police. I think there's a misconception that means abolish, and it certainly does not mean that because absolutely us as citizens want to feel protected and want to have law enforcement. I think it's just more of a matter of the issue of the George Floyd murder bringing out so many uh, so much tension and so many
right.
feelings because it's not the first time, right? So there are a lot of calls that don't go the way of what you described, where those officers who obviously were able to use the training they had and they were able to make the correct calls, but there seems to be a clear pattern of a lot of the calls that don't go the right way, of course, which leads us to the bigger questions like, do you believe there's systemic racism in law enforcement? Because there are so many examples that we've seen that are the only ones recorded. I'm sure there's other examples, right? But there are so many things where we keep running into these issues. So there wouldn't be these protests. There wouldn't be all of these calls for criminal justice. There wouldn't be so many examples of all of these issues if there weren't biases and problems. So, I mean, what is your take on that?
So at first, I don't think or believe that there's systemic racism in law enforcement. I believe there are people that should not be in law enforcement. I believe there are people that have fallen through the cracks and are racist or are just unfit to do the job. And I believe that's a very, very small percentage of people. And those people aren't always the ones that are involved in some of these violent situations that we see. And remember that law enforcement uh, arrest about 1.5 to 2 million violent offenders every single year. Think about that, 1.5 to 2 million violent offenders. We're talking about people wanted for carjackings and murders and assault and rape and people who are violent and in drug trafficking organizations. And the vast majority of those cases, of those incidents, are solved peacefully, where the person complied with the instructions of law enforcement, peacefully surrendered, and went to jail. A lot of the incidents we are seeing are people who have resisted arrest and taken upon themselves to not listen to the instructions of law enforcement. Now, that being said, I've seen some of the videos myself, George Floyd being one of them, and there are countless others that where law enforcement has made mistakes, critical mistakes, and then some of those mistakes um, have been prosecuted. And like I said, I think we're seeing the shift change a little bit. I think our community are tired, are some of the things they're saying, and I think our prosecutors have realized that, our law enforcement leaders have realized that, and that's why you're seeing more and more law enforcement officers charged criminally.
Yeah, and I think that is probably one of the bigger issues. So first, of course, it's why are these incidents happening? And like you said, there are people that maybe had a weapon or was resisting arrest. I don't know if it warrants them losing their life, but at the same token, the ones that don't, the issue has been the call for justice, right? Because a lot of the officers go unchecked. There aren't disciplinary actions. I mean, some of them don't even lose their jobs until there are protests to what's happening, and that's why we're kind of in this state of turmoil, and this country is so divisive as it is right now. It's just really hard to watch, and as you empathize as someone who's someone's daughter, someone's mother, like you have all of these different relationships, and you just empathizing with these families, it's really hard to see. And so do you feel that in terms of disciplinary action, like you obviously are actually criticized for taking disciplinary action? You're not getting the support of the FOP this year because they felt that you would not maybe protect law officers for unpopular use of force of violation. So, but I actually don't think that's a bad thing. So I know that you probably have kind of an overview in your opinion of how you see disciplinary action and how it should be enacted.
Well, going back to what you first said
Mhm.
about discipline and people only being fired and charged when when there's protests and when there's outrage. So don't forget, I have me and other many law enforcement leaders have terminated, disciplined, charged, and arrested numerous officers and deputies that never seems to make the news
Mhm.
and that we don't hear about, especially on a national level. So that's going on right now. That deputies, officers across the country are being disciplined properly because of the actions they take. And I think a lot of times we don't get the credit for that. That we are really keeping an eye on our own and policing ourselves. So secondly, you brought up the FOP. So the Fraternal Order of Police, the union that represents the membership here at the Orange County Sheriff's Office, is upset with me because of my harsh discipline, because of some of terminations and suspensions that I have given. And so what I have said is that I'm going to hold our deputies accountable, just like when I was at the chief of the Orlando Police Department. The FOP there was also upset with me for some of the harsh discipline I got. The difference there at the police department in that collective bargaining agreement had binding arbitration. So I was on the losing end of that arbitration. Several officers that I terminated were able to receive their job back through arbitration. At the sheriff's office, there is no binding arbitration. So when I say I'm the final decision making on discipline, when I say that I believe a deputy should be terminated, that stands. And so that has been frustration for the fraternal order police leadership, but I've always said I'm not going to be bullied or intimidated into lessening the amount of discipline when I believe that some deputies need to be held accountable for their actions.
Yeah, and I think that's actually really great. But I'm curious because it's a very, again, difficult position to be in. How do you keep good morale within the department and the balance between the community and the officers?
So it's a fine line. And first, remember, I'm the sheriff for all the residents in in Orange County, not just the deputies. But there's a fine line that any law enforcement leader has to, walk. That I have to support our deputies and show good leadership, but also I have to support the needs of the community. So what I'm doing now, I met with some deputies last night, kind of explain some of the reasons for my actions. We're able to give them a number of days off, because remember, they've been dealing with COVID. And they're not able to shelter and do Zoom meetings like this. They have to go out there every day, risk their lives, and then potentially expose themselves and their families to the pandemic. And then they went right into the social unrest, the protests. And I was out there at the protests, and frankly, there were people yelling profanity and very hateful and mean things at law enforcement, and they had never even met us before. Right. So you gotta look at it from our perspective. So I think if you were to take a survey of any metropolitan law enforcement agency in this time right now, you would probably see a lower morale. But so I'm meeting with the FOP leadership, meeting with deputies to kind of get their feel and get them back on the track. But I will say that the vast majority of this community loves, trusts, and respects law enforcement, and they have told us that. We're getting cards, letters, emails. I can't walk down the street without someone coming up to me and saying, "Hey, we got your back. We think your deputies are doing a good job, and keep up the great work. And we know you have a tough job." And remember, law enforcement is one of the most complex and difficult professions, and it's one of the most highly scrutinized, and it should be. But remember, our deputies, they have to make split-second decisions that could save their life or the life of a citizen, and it happens in the blink of the eye.
Yeah, yeah, and I've certainly had other conversations with others on the show that have way more expertise than I do. So there's two things I do want to touch on there before we start to wrap up. But one is, of course, the pandemic. You touched on, obviously we're meeting by Zoom, so that's changed, and it's been very hard in terms of how law enforcement has had to operate and shift and change. To me, just running a kung fu school, everything has been altered. So how has that really changed for all of you?
Yeah, so the good news is that we are used to dealing with people who have infectious diseases all the time, but now it's so much
Yeah.
more. So yeah, and we had all the equipment, we have the rubber gloves, we have the masks to keep our deputies safe. So now it was just a matter of putting those requirements in place. That yes, now every time a deputy comes in contact with someone in the public, we will be wearing a mask. We will put gloves on when necessary. One of the other things we did is we created a special response team. So if we're responding to a situation, and we get these calls all the time, people will call and say, "Hey, just let you know that that person has been tested positive for COVID."
Wow.
We'll send that special response team, and they'll wear full suits and face shields and gloves and masks before they ever make contact with that person. So that has been helpful. And we've also been responding to calls about restaurants or shopping centers where people haven't been wearing masks or violating one of the many executive orders. And we've been able to handle most of that through just verbal warnings, and
Mhm.
people get it. When law enforcement shows up, okay, either this person has to abide by the rules of the store and put on a mask, or they have to leave. And that's how we've been handling most of that. But it has been a difference for us as well, and we're working through it just like everyone else. Every time we come to work, we check our temperature, and we fill out a form and do a little screening process to make sure we're staying safe.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioning that's like a new issue, right? Hey, these guys are showing up at the mall without their masks. Like that would seem like something someone maybe else could be trained to handle and has an authoritative position. Hopefully it doesn't escalate to violence. I mean, but it seems like that's quite a lot for law enforcement to have to also go onto a call like that, where it's like, oh, these guys aren't wearing their masks and not being responsible citizens. So that's like, again, another rabbit hole. I did want to get to the protests, because it goes without saying, as an officer, you're taking on a great deal of risk, but it is also the job of the officer to protect and police citizens, right? And so it's like you said, you're getting scrutinized, and of course there are hateful things, and there are people that, just like in the realm of law enforcement, that are protesting. Most people are peaceful, but then there are people that decide that it would be a good idea to throw a rock or do something that's much more violent and not in the lines of peaceful protest. So I think it goes both ways there as well. And for the first time, I think after the George Floyd incident, it seemed like law enforcement is normally on the defensive, right? And this is kind of the first time I saw a little bit of that empathy that I think is kind of that step in the right direction, especially where I've seen a lot of officers kneeling with protesters and listening and taking a little bit of a different stance than in the past. But then I've had people tell me, on the other hand, I was at a protest and, 1 minute they're kneeling with us, 1 minute they're throwing tear gas at us. And then, there was dissonance between certain protesters who are mostly white that didn't want to quarantine, and the way they were treated versus the way people in the Black Lives Matter protests were treated. And so there's still kind of that dissonance and imbalance, and it makes it still feel like, what actions are sincere and who do we trust?
Oh, and remember, when the protests started here, remember we did have some looting. Maybe not related to the protest, but people were taking advantage of that. And then so, yeah, I knelt with protesters. I wanted to listen to what they had to hear, and the vast majority of protesters were peaceful. The vast majority, did the right thing. But there were groups of people who violated the curfew. There were groups of people who threw rocks and bottles and bricks. I know 3 of my deputies were hit with rocks, and that's not a very pleasant experience. One Orlando Police Department officer was hit in the face with a brick, which caused him to have a broken nose. I mean, that is a serious issue. And so that type of violence is going to be met with some kind of reaction. We have always said, going back to my time as chief, we've let people block roadways. We have let people lay down in front of the Amway Center. And as long as people have remained peaceful, we haven't, made arrests or used any type of force. But we have always said, the minute there is property damage, the minute there is violence, that's going to have to stop. And when we're getting rocks and bottles thrown at us, we have responded at times, not all the time, with tear gas. And remember, tear gas, pepper spray, chemical spray, that doesn't cause permanent injury. It is an irritant and does help disperse the crowd, because a lot of times, those crowds, what happens is they get into that mob mentality, and it just takes a few people to start committing violence, start doing things that are very, very dangerous, before it can get out of hand. And you've seen that in other cities. We actually found Molotov cocktails here in Orlando, staged. That's extremely dangerous. We've found protesters with hammers, slingshots, rocks, bottles, and knives, coming to the protest with these things. So not everyone was there to peacefully protest. There were groups of people who specifically came here to cause violence, to cause disruption, to cause property damage, and to elicit a response from law enforcement.
Yeah, and I always get frustrated about that, because obviously there was also, people that said, oh, there are people trying to portray the protesters as violent and would show up to to be kind of that jackal, that problem person. But at the same time, it's curious whether it's a result of, because the officers are there in riot gear and they're ready to go, and it feels combative. It feels very much like, well, I feel like if I'm there, I need to be able to defend myself. But I understand what you're saying. There's no, it's a tough thing. Like, I my cousin's in law enforcement. I obviously would never want anything to happen. I don't think it's fair that people that don't know you and don't know what you try to fight for and haven't taken the time to talk to you are judgmental, but it's also unfortunately part of the tough job. Like, it's not,
Right.
that's why not everyone does it. If it were easy, everyone would do it, right? It would be like, oh, well,
Right.
I'll just do this. Like I've never served in the military. I'm just not, that's not my personality. And I have so much respect for that because I think it's such a selfless thing. I think it's such an amazing act of service. And so I understand that. And it is a tough thing, but it's a little bit of one of the things that comes with the job, I'm guessing.
Right.
What is your response to the federal government getting involved? Like, you see that happening in Portland, possibility of in Chicago. Do you think that is called for?
Well, for one, I'm glad that here in Orange County and in Orlando, we have not had, the federal authorities come here. We haven't had the need for that. I know, I don't know everything about what's going on in Portland, Seattle, and Chicago, but I have seen some disturbing things. Um, and when we, going back to the violence part, I mean, there are people trying to light things on fire. I saw some videos of some federal authorities just merely trying to protect a federal building. That being said, as sheriff, I think I can handle what's going on here. I have a large agency. I have a lot of local law enforcement that can help us with needed. So I wouldn't want that support from them. I wouldn't need it because when you have different entities coming in, federal law enforcement, I can't control what they're doing and that what message that is sending. So I would prefer just to handle it myself, no matter how bad it got. I think I could do that. So I'm not a big fan of having the federal authorities in a city um, uh, assisting or doing their own thing.
Yeah, I love that you said support, whereas in my mind, I think intervention. I think it's a little bit more of a problem than a bigger problem, and hopefully that doesn't spread. But I'm not really sure, and we of course don't know where that's headed. But I. Final thing is, of course, we're running out of time. I'd love to talk to you more about criminal justice and understand a lot more. And I appreciate you, again, always having these candid conversations with me and taking the time. It's so important. I think these discussions are insightful for people who are listening to really kind of understand the process and what's going on in your mind. And so, what do you hope to accomplish if reelected as sheriff of Orange County?
So, number one, my job is to keep people safe. So, we've been very fortunate here where crime continues to decrease. Violent crime is down by 12%. Overall crime is down by 19%. So, I want to keep us on that trajectory of decreasing crime and not increasing crime, keeping our people safe. I also want to keep up with the growth. They say, 1,000 to 1,500 people are moving to Central Florida. So we, as the sheriff office, as the county continues to grow, so do we. Because like I said, I continue to get those calls about um, neighborhoods wanting more deputies, more law enforcement, more quicker response times. And then lastly, but certainly not last on the list, one of my priorities is to continue to have that conversation with our community, continue to improve upon our procedures, looking at our use of force policy, looking at our, how we do internal investigations. Happy to have those conversations. So right now, my Citizens Advisory Committee is looking at our use of force policy. They're taking input from the community, and they are developing recommendations that will be put into our use of force policy. So very pleased with the way that's going. And of course, we're going to continue our fight against human trafficking and as well as opioid epidemic. I think that's something that's been lost in all of this. Lost amongst COVID, lost amongst some of the social unrest. There's still 125 people a day in this country that die from opioid overdoses. So we're still working hard on that as well.
Well, the one thing that can be guaranteed is there'll be a lot of problems for you to try to solve because
Always.
there's always things going on. So again, thank you so much for spending time talking to me today. Hopefully you'll be able to come back when things are a little bit less crazy, if that ever happens. So things are less crazy, but I do appreciate it. And I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Great to be with you, Mimi. Thank you.